Welcome, Dr. James Beckett, Sports Card Insights. The second part of my conversation with Mark Armour and Jason Schwartz. Thanks sponsors, Topps Panini Upper Deck, Heritage Auctions, Huggins Scott Auctions, Mike's Stadium Sports Cards, Burbank Sports Cards, ComC.com, and Beckett Media, Beckett Grading, Beckett Authentication. These guys care about the hobby. They had some good questions, and I enjoyed answering them. So thanks again, guys.
When Mark and I talked about the 1980s with each other, that to us was a very tumultuous and impactful decade in terms of walking into the 1980s, where generally collectors were kids. They might keep cards in their pocket. They might not assign a lot of monetary value to anything. And then, of course, by the end of the decade, cards were often thought of as investments. Adults were getting in on it. Cards were in these almost bulletproof lucite cases in some instances. So the 80s, definitely, things really changed a lot from beginning to end. But if you think about the 1970s, do you see any trends or any major difference between the hobby at the beginning of the decade versus the end?
Huge differences. We're all of a certain age. You can't pick your birth year. You can't pick your birth parents. A lot of things you can't pick. So if I'd have been born 10 years earlier, then I would have ripened as an adult 10 years earlier, and I would have been hitting the scene in the 60s with being an adult card collector. Coming out of college, there wasn't anything going on in the 60s. I may have moved on and done something else because the situation wasn't right. By the same token, if I were 10 years younger than I am now and I emerged in the 80s, it would have been too late. Even though my first price guide book was in 1979 and the magazine was in 84, all my preparation and understanding and wisdom, I really garnered a lot in the 70s, and it was there to be collected, the wisdom, the nuggets from the veteran collectors, because it was much smaller. So I came up at exactly the right time. Later, it was also the intersection of having personal publishing and digital ways that didn't exist before that. So the 70s were perfect. There were no rookie cards before the 70s. There were no trade shows to speak of before the 70s. There were some major distributors, but no medium-sized dealers. You couldn't have had a card show with 100 dealers because there weren't 100 dealers. There were 3 or 4 Larry Fritsch type guys, Bruce Yecko, Sam Rosen, Woody Gelman, guys that had hundreds of thousands of cards. But by the 70s, there were people that had 10 or 20,000 cards, mostly vintage. And that's a decent stock that you can have fun with and trade with. So I was in the right place at the right time. The card show circuit did not exist in the 60s. By the 80s, it was oversaturated. So me being able to go in the 70s toward the beginning of the decade, middle decade, end of the decade, I could go to a different show in 75, you couldn't go every weekend to a major show, but it was getting there that every month the Cincinnati show was always in November, but then the Indianapolis show was always in February. It'd be whatever, the second week of the month. So you could set your calendar. There were New York shows I could go to. There were Cleveland, Detroit, Chicago. That didn't exist in the 60s. By the 80s, it was a madhouse. In the 70s, it was manageable, and I really soaked it up. Again, I was single throughout the decade of the 70s. So I just can't underestimate how the 70s was the perfect decade for me to come in. It's probably the same thing about the birth of Sabre. You know, there were people getting together and they were loosely organized, and there was a lot of knowledge in the hands of a few. And what Sabre did and what I did, I think to some degree, is democratize that information and get it out there. Just like with Sabre, you're disclosing all these secrets. No, but they won't be secrets. It still requires a lot of knowledge. But the dealers that were concerned that I was going to be publishing a price guide so that everybody would know what cards are worth, that would somehow be bad for business, it was the opposite. Same thing with Sabre. The more publishing activity, it just really fully blossomed. So that blossoming was in the 70s. In the 70s, I could go to those shows and I would literally know everybody there. When I started a price guide, I wasn't an anonymous person. I already had the relationships. I knew who the straight shooters were. By the 80s, you couldn't know. So the 70s are a big part of the story, Mark. Now, the 80s, when it was such a complicated mess, very blessed to have amazing teammates because when I started the company, I populated it with people. I won't say they were all like me, but they all loved the hobby. They loved the sport. The price guide guys, we had a great team. We had people that did customer service. They weren't as up on the hobby, but they were fabulous in other ways. We had a wonderful team. So when things got chaotic and huge, we actually did handle it. I don't want to be too critical, but there's a big difference between publishing or card manufacturer, grading, whatever it would be, any company in the industry that relates to baseball. If you're not a baseball fan, good luck following a CEO that doesn't love baseball or sports. That's happened sometimes. They can be a brilliant Harvard MBA, whatever, but if they don't love baseball, can you imagine having the head of Sabre being somebody that's just a great executive, but doesn't know anything about baseball? That'd be crazy. So I was the customer. When thinking about what would the customer want, I think, what would I want? You want people in the leadership of these companies to say, what would they want? And to be close enough to it, either personally or I didn't have to get a focus group. So when people would say, you're overkill, we don't need a price guide for all the cards and all the sets, just the ones that people care about. I said, I care about all the cards. I'm a customer. I think a lot of people care about, no, they only care about the valuable ones. Well, which ones are valuable? I didn't do a vote. I didn't say, hey, what do you think? I said, this is what is needed. I can do it. I'm going to do it. And then I assembled teammates that helped as it got bigger and bigger. I would have freaked out. I probably did freak out. But again, having great teammates made it so much more fun. I was me, myself, and I for most of the 70s. I had Denny Eckes, who was my great friend and kind of business partner with the Sport Americana price guides, how I got started with that. And then after a while, I moved away and then we split. He maintained his business. But like I say, I already knew about baseball, but I had to learn about personal publishing and mainstream publishing, bookstores, all that stuff, internet, all those things that came up. So, Mark, I was in the right place at the right time with a skill set that worked and being in Dallas with a population rich in talent. When we went to hire people, a lot of it was friend of a friend. We started off with some really good people. They had good friends and we'd advertise some, but we got a really strong team because there's lots of people in Dallas that want to work for a company that's a fun company to work for.
About the 70s, one of the things that obviously changed for you is that your perspective, when you talked about the 50s, you talked about being a kid and only caring about the current year and going to the store. And in the 1970s, of course, you're an adult and you've got money and you're buying older cards. Do you feel the child collector, the 10-year-old, got left behind by this sort of revolution? A 10-year-old in 1975, because he wasn't going to shows, he didn't have that kind of money. Was he just operating the same way you were 15 years earlier?
There was nothing to do except neighborhood in the 60s. When I was 10, it was a neighborhood activity. There wasn't a collecting club. There wasn't any place to go. It was going over to somebody's house. No organization at all. By the 70s, there could be some father-sons or some moms that dropped off their sons. Little Billy Mastro, if you remember the name, or Rob Lifson, who were younger than me, and they were teenagers when I met them. They were super sharp and very aggressive. So in the aggressiveness quotient in the 60s, I just had no money. I loved cards, but I didn't have any money. And it was a neighborhood thing. In the 70s, I did have some money because I was working. I worked hard. I had good jobs. And I was a very aggressive buyer. Okay. Buy, sell, trade, buying collections. Throughout the 70s, that itch was scratched in a big way. So I assembled a really great collection, had plenty of stuff. Okay, you get to the decade of the 80s, I become a publisher and an author. First half of the decade, I was weaning away from being a big buyer or seller to avoid the conflict. As we went through the 80s, I sold some stuff in order to fund my company, but I quit buying stuff. That's why it's been so much fun for me the last decade or two. After I've sold my company, I can buy cards again. I don't buy as big as I used to, but I just enjoy going through some new cards that I haven't seen. That's the other part. In the 70s, you could buy almost without having a budget. Just as crazy. You weren't going to run out of money. You would just buy the cards that came. And you would offer a reasonable amount at the time, which now looks like you robbed them, but the cards didn't have as much value there. To buy anything and everything that I could possibly buy in the 70s, I did. It would be very rare that somebody would say, I want $200 for my collection. And I would say, I'm offering 100, and he walked away. That's what it would be like. And so here's your 200. So it just wasn't. And would that be worth 2,000 now? For sure, at least. But it probably was only worth 300 when I offered 100 because of liquidity, and he wanted 200. But how did he know to even have 200 when there wasn't a price guide? He just wanted 200 because I said 100. So in the 70s, it was the Wild West. By the 80s, there was order. So for me to buy collections, it just didn't make a lot of sense. So I was a collector and I was a dealer. And then I became an author and a publisher. And now I'm going back to being a collector, having fun with buying enough activity to just have some fun with it. But every decade has a unique character. And if I'd have come up in the 90s, I would have been more of a digital native. Our company, we had online auctions before eBay existed. We had live and online telephone and internet bidding of auctions. But we did not press that advantage. That was in 1993 because it wasn't our main business. I should have doubled down on that. I didn't because we were busy doing price guides. I should have done grading at that time because PSA was catching on and built up a big lead. And finally, when I said, yeah, I think it wouldn't be a conflict for us to do grading, by then, that's the late 90s. That was 5 years later than it should have been because I saw myself as a cataloging price guide guy and not a marketer or a grader or a auctioneer.
The 60s, that was a pre-rookie card era of the hobby.
Yeah, rookie card, the term of art didn't exist.
For me, my second year collecting 1979, Fred Lynn was having a great year. And some kids in the class through older brothers or cousins had that 1975 rookie card. That was considered undesirable at the time because there were 4 guys on it and Fred Lynn was so little, right? His 76 card was fun. It had the trophy and it was all him. That's a small sample size, obviously. That tells me at least in my school, rookie card premiums hadn't hit yet.
But I will say this, by the mid 70s, by the late 70s for sure, rookie cards were a thing. And in the 80s, it really took, I think the catalytic event probably were the magazines. Because when you started seeing up arrows for cards and a lot of them have an RC on it, then you're saying, hey, that's where the action is. And the hot lists and things we did. If a player's hot, you were going to go straight to his rookie card. But in the 60s, it really didn't exist. In the mid 70s, in 74 maybe, I remember a guy out of New York offering to trade me, and he wanted any Jackie Robinsons. And of course, now we realize that any Topps Jackie Robinson. So that's only 52, 53, 54, 55, 56. They're all great cards. Okay, so he was paying $2 a piece for them. But that wasn't a rookie card thing. That was just kind of the regional demand. It wasn't racial. He just was very popular in New York. This was a guy in the New York, New Jersey area, a big dealer that I befriended, but I'd like to undo that trade that I did. The other thing he wanted was 54 Topps errands. So he didn't say he wanted errands that are 55 or 56 or 57 or 58 or 59. He just wanted 54 errands. And he didn't say it was to complete a set or anything. He just said, I like them. I like them. As many as you got, I'll take them. Same deal, $2 a piece. They were the first ones to really advertise in Sport Collectors Digest that they're buying superstars. They went around the country and did that. So I'm sure I sampled them, sent them a couple because they weren't hard to get. The problem is you always think in this sports card hobby that what's common today will be common tomorrow. And that's a bad assumption. When somebody makes a run on something, they dry up or the price goes way up. In fact, I traded the errands for Willie Mays 55 tops because it was a high number. So me being the supply side guy, I'm thinking Aaron, just a base card, a great player at the time. But you got Mays, arguably greater, and this is the next year of Mays, and arguably smaller production because of being a high number in 55 tops. That was a bad decision. It probably was a fair trade at the time. But 2 years later, when all of a sudden rookie cards are a thing, and Aaron is one of the only guys that broke out in those early price surveys that predated the books, when I was circulating around all the dealers and collectors around the country for price surveys, Aaron was quoted at $5 for 54 tops, 128 Hank Aaron rookie card. And people weren't saying, "Oh, that's way too low." They're saying, "No, it's worth $6 now," or something. I sold it for $6.
The man in the house of cards is doing